You either love him or you hate him. Some people see him as a force of good, others see him as a force of evil. Today we'll be looking at both sides so that we can look at it objectively. Because even the best person in this world can make mistakes, and even the worst person in this world can sometimes do right things. So we'll be looking at the top three good things and the top three bad or evil things of Donald Trump. So starting off with the good stuff. President Trump has declared that he wants to be seen as a peacemaker. He wants to be somebody who's responsible for ending wars, not starting them. And realistically, if we look at his first term, he did not start any new major wars, and he actually tried to wind up the old ones. In the second term, even before he took office, he was adamant that he wanted to see an end to the Russia-Ukraine war, and also on Palestine, he took a very strong stance where he made it a precondition of his inauguration ceremony that he wanted a ceasefire. The first time that there was a ceasefire was the one which was organized by Trump right before his inauguration. And even at that time, the Palestinians were close to starving and they had no food or medicines. And there was a complete ceasefire that took place for about a couple of months. And food and medicine and everything was organized to be delivered and was delivered to the people in Gaza. And so it's interesting in terms of the people who oppose him, because there are a lot of people out there, who are strongly critical of Trump because of the Palestinian issue, and they are right to a large extent. But it's just important to note that, none of the other countries, none of the other people, none of the other scholars, influencers, none of them was able to have a ceasefire in Palestine even for a day. And it was Trump, who made this a precondition for the inauguration and organized the ceasefire. Now, the fact that, again, it turned back to a bad situation is something that we'll discuss again. But it's also important to understand that, as I think the entire world knows, the president of the US isn't entirely a free person. He has to operate in a very, tight spot. We all know about a president that was shot, and we also know that there was an assassination attempt on Trump himself before he was inaugurated or elected as president. And so, he's got to operate within that space. So a lot of people will just look at what he says, but I think, like everybody else in this world, it's important to look at what people do rather than what people say. So, although he talks about the casinos and resettlement and everything, but the reality is, on the ground so far in terms of the score, he was the only person who was successfully able to organize a ceasefire, although it was still relatively brief. Now, the other side of the coin obviously is going to be the evil side, but that we'll discuss in a few minutes once we get to that side. Similarly, in the Russia-Ukraine war, there was an initial spat with J.D. Vance and Zelensky during a press conference, but I personally think that was more of a J.D. Vance thing. But gradually, he managed to convince Zelensky and Putin to have the peace talks in Ankara. So he's, continuously going at it in that sense of being a peacemaker. The other thing which is very interesting and positive about Trump is his sheer stamina, agility, and energy at this age. I mean, he's close to 80 years old now. He's about 78 years. But if you look at the number of executive orders, the lengthy press conferences, the endless question and answer sessions in just the first few days, it's difficult even for any young leader in the world, in the past or the present, to match that kind of energy. The other factor is resilience. And resilience is the ability of somebody to just keep coming back, until they achieve their objective. And so it doesn't matter how many times they fail, how bad it gets, they keep going at it until they get there. And so if we look back at the end of the first term of President Trump, he was almost impeached by the number of cases that he had. And the cases continued, going on very strong afterwards, and even before his election, And there was a time when a lot of people had written him off. They said, this is the end of Trump, he's not coming back. But gradually, he kept going at it, and then he won by quite a landslide. So resilience is a factor that he's capable of displaying. Now, in terms of the values, it's a very interesting and controversial one. Most people, and especially his opponents, would say, he's a person he is a person who has no values, especially looking at his past life. However, interestingly, during the inauguration, he mentioned two things. He sort of took very strong stances on a couple of things. One is, he said there's just going to be two genders, male and female. That's our policy. And he said we're going to bring back common sense again, which was quite a clear, powerful statement. And similarly, he said, there will be, the presence of, we will recognize the presence of God, in the government in our country. And this is the US, where atheism gradually has spread, and, it's almost known as one of the most secular countries in the world. So for him to go and say, we are going to return to God, or there's going to be a place of God in the country, reflects that, at least at this point, he is bearing certain values. Now, getting to the bad or evil stuff, ridicule is at the top of the list. Irrespective of how popular you are, how many votes you've got, nobody should be allowed to make fun of others. You can criticize your opponents, you can criticize their policies, you can criticize the way they do things, but just purely making fun of other people or ridiculing other people is something that is not acceptable and should not be acceptable, irrespective of what your status is and irrespective of what kind of popularity wave you're on. Because one of the other implications of this is, it's not just the fact that Trump is doing this himself, it's the fact that he's encouraging this in the supporters, who will blindly follow him for everything that he says or does. So he's sort of, and that is probably one of the reasons why there is so much polarization in the country right now, is because they will just make fun of the other side. And so ridicule for a good person, especially for a good leader, should have no place in his personality. The second thing on the evil side, like I said earlier, is will be the Palestine thing. Although, on the one hand, he was the only person who was able to make a ceasefire happen, and he seems to be trying to, go in that direction again. But at the same time, his opponents say, and technically they're right. He is the president of the U.S., and so irrespective of what tight spot he's in, if he claims to be such a courageous person, if he claims to be such a smart person, he's already in his second term, so given his age and the fact that he's in a second term, people would say he should put his foot down and, stop the genocide and stop these kind of policies. And that's a very, so from that angle, that is a valid criticism, and that is something that he definitely needs to look at. The other thing which is on the bad side is the amount of exaggeration that he does in a number of things when he's talking about his achievements is just, through the roof. It's just outside the normal complete scope. And exaggeration is just a polite way of putting it, but it's, essentially you're talking about false statements. You're just basically talking about lying. And so, he doesn't need to do that, and he shouldn't be doing that. Now, the fact that you can talk about aspirations, that is a good thing. I want to do X, Y, Z, and, I want to do good stuff to a certain level. But when you talk about actual things that you've done or the achievements that you've had, he shouldn't be lying. And the fact that he, almost at times, is lying through his teeth is not a good thing. Again, that's not just good for him, but it also impacts a lot of his followers, because then they would also think that this is acceptable. Last but not the least, things like climate change. Now, you could argue in terms of the actual impact that it is having in this world. Some people might say it's more, some people might say it's less. But to say that this doesn't exist, to take such positions is actually ridiculous. So that was a very brief look at the good stuff and the bad stuff. So now obviously it's up to you to make up your mind that on balance, do you see more good or do you see more bad? Because the idea is just to look at things objectively, instead of just looking at it from a love-hate prism. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you.